Well, good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's first breakout session, which is up close and personal, the landowner's perspective. My name is Mike DeGan. I'm an attorney with Q-Tech Rock in Omaha, and I've been involved with wind development in Nebraska on the developer side since 2009. As John Hanson, who's just walking in the back, can attest to, over that period of time, we've seen great strides here in Nebraska. Back in 2009 and 2010, there were just a handful of projects, wind projects that had actually gone up in Nebraska. They were primarily built and supported by the public power industry. And then in about 2009 and 2010, there was a concerted effort to expand and modify Nebraska's laws relating to energy development to really allow Nebraska to tap into the full potential of its wind. And in order to do that, we needed to open this state up to development. And we have been successful to a large extent in doing that. But along the way, we've certainly seen our share of growing pains. Back in 2009, 2010, when we'd have board meetings or zoning meetings to approve a wind plan, I don't think we ever saw an opponent. And in fact, oftentimes we'd be cheered because Nebraskans were just anxious to get these projects, to be able to take advantage of our abundant wind resource. But then along the way, as more projects got approved and built, of course, you have the next growing pain, which is the fact of living next to them and living among them. Because the fact remains, the wind towers are tall and wind farms are large, and they can take a little bit of getting used to. So we've now moved into a phase where people have questions about how these are managed, how they're operated, what it's like to live next to them, what kind of implications there are long-term for wind farms. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So we thought we'd use this afternoon's session to allow you all to hear firsthand from folks that have been through the process, that have actually contracted with developers to put wind towers on their property, to tell you firsthand what it's like to live among them. So with me today is Leroy Kirkman. He's immediately to my left. Leroy is a current Antelope County supervisor. And he currently has, Leroy, one turbine on your property up in Antelope County. And seated to his left is Mike Zakshredsky. Am I saying that right? He tells me to call him Mike Z, so I might take him up on that. Mike has property up in Holt County, where he currently has 13 turbines in the Grand Prairie project. In addition to that, he has a number more turbines that are in his sightline. So they will be our distinguished panel today. And the way that we'll proceed is I'll have them lay some foundation on generally what their experiences have been, and then we'll leave some time for questions from the audience. So maybe to start out with, Leroy, if you can tell the audience a little bit about your property and what you do on your property.
My particular property, I'm a grain farmer anymore. I used to have livestock, but as I got older and the kids left, I quit the livestock business, so I'm just strictly grain. I have one tower that is on my place. That would come up in phase 3 of the Prairie Breeze. I was a county supervisor. I stayed away from having a wind tower, particularly on my place, as long as it didn't really affect me. They were on the west side of me. Prairie Breeze 1 and 2 was south. So I didn't want to get involved in it as a conflict of interest with my job as a county supervisor. But when they come back on Prairie Breeze 3, it come through my land in order to get back to the substation. So then I put the tower up on my place. So that's how I got into it.
Mike, how about you? Tell us a little bit about your property and where you live.
Sure. I'm third generation farmer and rancher in northern Holt County, northeast of O'Neill. We are irrigated row crop and livestock cow-calf production. Like Leroy, I kind of stumbled into the wind project back in 2007. And from my front door, within a 1-mile radius between mine and my neighbor's turbines, there are 14 of them spinning around my property. So I'm very well accustomed to them, and hopefully can answer any questions that you might have.
Now, before the Grand Prairie project started going up in your area, did you have any opinions regarding wind? Good thing, bad thing, indifferent?
In general, I was for it. That being said, back in 2007, I knew absolutely nothing about the wind industry, and I started attending these conferences at that time, learned a lot, talked to as many people as I could, read everything I could. And the more I learned about it, the more there was to like, and so I became involved in the process, and here we are 10 years later, and we're just finishing our first year of production. So.
Now, when we talked last week, you had indicated that you really did immerse yourself in studied the issue. Did you look at other states' experiences and other landowners?
Absolutely. I have relatives in Minnesota, so that was a good resource. Iowa, of course, everybody drives through there, and it seems like they have been there forever. And so there were a lot of good resources to see what worked and what did not work in other areas. It was, pretty new here in Nebraska, so limited resources to draw from locally. So yes, I did go out of state.
Okay. Now, Leroy, what was your recollection of how the Prairie Breeze project was received in your community? Was there resistance or was there support?
Well, Boone County put the first wind farm up there, Laredo Ridge, probably 2 years before they ever come to Antelope County. And I live in the southern part of Antelope County, so that was only 2 or 3 miles from me. I didn't hear anybody complaining about it. And so when we started in Antelope County, we put Prairie Breeze 1 up, and that's about the time that the $7 and $8 corn hit the market too. So there were people that developed land, and then towers got moved to different places. And so nobody complained about that particularly at that time. But after the towers got built, there was a few individuals, the wind noise and so forth. And so, but for the most part, it's receptive.
Okay, so you were in a situation that you were looking at him before you even lived in a county that was benefiting from him.
Yes. And, as being a county supervisor, too, we're looking for economic development to come to our counties. Out there in that rural area, our schools are getting smaller. The kids are going down here in the city. You can't hardly build them fast enough. Out there, pretty soon there'll be 2 and 3 counties to support one school. That's
Right.
just the way it's going.
Mm-hmm. So, Mike, how did you get involved? Were you approached by a developer, or did you put together a landowner group?
Okay, all of the above, actually. We were approached as a landowner entity, I guess, back in 2007 by a developer out of Chicago, and had our first landowner meeting, and they named me chairman of the landowner group, and so that's kind of how I got started with the hands-on experience with it. And as I got to know the development team, they did everything correct and earned our trust, and so we enjoyed the long road of working with them throughout pre-development. Fortunately, our development company insisted on a no most favored nation status in the contract, and that means all for one, everybody gets exactly the same deal. And I was very happy with that. In fact, I think I would have insisted had they not. And so, yes, we did collectively bargain as a group. We had our attorneys, of course, on our side, and they had theirs. We modeled after a basic template, and I would say for 80% of the contract, we followed more or less that template, except for unique circumstances in our situation that we had to get into some individualized aspects of it.
And how big was your group that you were working with?
Roughly about 100 entities, separate landowner entities, and many of them were family partnerships and whatever, so ultimately probably 200, 250 individuals, so quite a large group to come to a consensus. But a very good group, a very positive group, eager to move the process forward.
Okay, now Leroy, your experience was a little different. You negotiated your lease one-on-one with your developer, is that right?
No, we had probably a group of about 30 individuals that, seek legal advice before we ever started with this wind projects too. But I personally didn't get involved in that. And so after, that was on Prairie Breeze 1. And so when Prairie Breeze 1 was built, and then they come back and we put in, they put a large transmission line from our substation, which is a couple miles south of me, over to near Battle Creek, which is quite a lot in distance that they had to travel with that. And so that was a 200 megawatt farm. And then Prairie Breeze 2 was 73 megawatts, and then Prairie Breeze 3 was 36 megawatts. That was 20 turbines. That's the project that I was involved in, the very last one.
Did you have any transmission facilities across your property?
No, I did not.
Okay. What was your experience in negotiating with the landowner? Was that, just in general, what types of terms were negotiated? Did you have any experience or background in doing that?
No. I visited quite extensively with those individuals that went into that, met with their attorneys first and so forth about the wind turbines. They come to my place, being I was a supervisor, and ask some questions about and give me their opinions, what they thought we should do. So we negotiated too, as a board, with the wind people on our zoning regulations. Is that what you're interested in, or?
Yeah, just generally how
Yep.
how the process worked.
Yes.
So how long of a lease did you enter into?
It's let's see, 20 years.
Got a 20-year term? How about you, Mike?
Yeah, ours is 20 years also with 2 10-year options on the end of it.
Ours is too.
Okay. Now, what were some of your concerns? You'd immersed yourself in some of these landowner issues. Throughout that process, were there certain issues that you identified that you thought was important to deal with the developer from the outset?
Yeah, I guess, we took every aspect of it pretty seriously because it was all new and foreign to us, and we wanted to make, darn sure to get it right, both for us and for the county. And so the siting, I guess, was high on our list to avoid any issues we could as far as siting. The environmental aspect of it was important, but of course that's handled, on a government basis, and so that was kind of out of our hands as far as negotiations. A lot of the terms, the financial terms, we negotiated a little bit back and forth, but everybody knew the general sense of where it was going to end up, and so that wasn't really contentious. A few in our group, the hunting rights were actually very important to them, and so we spent quite a bit of time defining hunting rights within the project area.
Okay, and how was that how was that resolved? Is hunting allowed on the properties?
With limitations, and it's different for archery and for firearms. There's a setback required that you cannot go invade, I guess.
Okay, and these are protections to avoid damage to the turbines?
And the turbine
Or the
workers,
towers.
the maintenance workers. We have 25 maintenance workers that work full-time on these 200 turbines, and so at any given time, they could be at any given turbine.
Now, you mentioned siting issues, and you also mentioned that you're irrigated land. What types of considerations did you experience working with developers come into play when they're deciding where to site towers?
Well, just like Leroy had mentioned, during the negotiations process, it happened to be the $7 and $8 a bushel corn era, and so everyone was very concerned that we first and foremost preserve the productive acres that we have, so we in no way shoot ourselves in the foot by adding these turbines.
Did you do an approximation of approximately how much arable land that you lost or that you traded in terms for space taken up by the towers?
Yeah, very minimal. The turbine sites themselves are a 100-foot diameter circle, and we farm or graze right up to the turbine bases themselves. And then you have access roads going from turbine to turbine, and so that takes out a little bit of the area. We're about a 50,000 acre total project area, and with the access roads and the turbine circles, out of that 50,000 acres, I would be surprised if more than 200 are tied up in this project.
Okay, Leroy, did you have any issues with pivots on your property for siting?
No, mine's on a corner of a pivot. I've lost less than an acre. It's where the pivot is than the road going out to the main road on my particular project. But some of the places west of town there is pretty hilly pasture land, and so there was quite a few towers put on that particular land too. And they made roads through those fields, but those people that own that land, they were getting compensated well. So at that point in time, the cattle price was not very good when the corn price was high, so they welcomed the tower payments.
I bet. Leroy, in your negotiations with the developer, was decommissioning part of that conversation, and was it included in your lease?
Yes, it was. The decommissioning on ours is between the landowner himself and the company.
Okay. But in addition to that, Antelope County has also adopted their own regulations.
Yes,
for
we
decommissioning.
have. We have adopted our own regulations too. They have a bond that they have set forth.
Okay, so the decommissioning element in your particular instance is belt and suspenders. It's in your lease, and it's also
Yes.
by local ordinance. Now, Mike, that's a little different with you. If I understand right, the developer originally had decommissioning language, but your landowner group decided to go a different direction. Is that right?
Well, sort of. The mechanics of the decommissioning language is still in our contracts, but the teeth of them we decided to turn over to our county board of supervisors. And the reason for that is because in the worst case scenario, if there were issues during decommissioning, it would essentially become a county-wide issue anyways. And so we gave them the authority to enforce
The
the
decommissioning.
decommissioning plan.
And if I could jump back on the siting, did you have anybody in your landowner group that wanted a turbine but was unable to get one sited because of combination of factors, pivots, topography, wind speed? Did you have any of those issues where people were left out?
Definitely, there were some folks that were, disappointed, and like you said, you touched on the factors. Environmental factors were probably the main reason for whether it's too low or swampy ground. We late in the process discovered a newly formed bald eagle nest in the northeast corner of our project area, and so that shot out about a 10-mile radius of folks who were greatly disappointed. So,
Were there any airport approaches on?
we are outside of the 10 miles FAA circle or whatever from our nearest airport, if that's what you mean.
Okay, so you were outside of that radius?
Yeah, we're right on the edge of it, though, so we kind of lucked out in that sense.
Okay. Leroy, you had an issue up in Antelope County on the upstream project.
Yes, we did have on the upstream project, which is north of Neely. And when we were going through all those hearings, I thought that airport there in Neely must be Eppley Airfield the way they laid it out. I mean, my gosh, there was all kinds of planes landing all the time. And the 4th of July come, and they had a drag race out there on this runway. So I come to the next meeting, and I ask them people, how could you have that drag race on that runway with all those planes coming in and out?
And they said very carefully.
Oh, the one guy says, well, if there was a plane coming in, we'd have moved it.
But nevertheless, I mean, with airport approaches, that takes a large cone out of
Yes.
play, does it not?
We have the one in Neely and plus the Creighton one.
Now, eventually, both your projects move to the next stage, which is getting your local county approval. Mike, could you describe the process? How did that go up in Holt County, and did you participate in it?
Yeah, I did participate. We were very fortunate in Holt County to have almost unanimous public support, and that carried over into our Board of Supervisors and really all of our governing bodies in the city, the school, the county board. They were very progressive, very receptive to helping us become approved and move into the production or the construction phase.
Did you draw much public opposition to that project?
Not at that time. There's a little bit now, a very small minority with very loud voices, and I think that's typical. Mainly they don't like the way they look. But at that time, during the approval process, there were some out-of-area token appearances at hearings, anti-wind, anti-everything, but they didn't receive much credibility, nor did they deserve to at that time.
What were the types of issues that were addressed either at zoning or at your county approval in terms of being addressed by any of the public concerns, if there were any?
You know, it was a pretty smooth process. Part of that was probably just because we didn't know what we didn't know, you know. It was new and foreign to all of us. We all generally thought it was a great idea, but didn't probably have the experience to have much, as long as the zoning regulations were met, and they were, everyone seemed satisfied.
Okay, Leroy, what was your experience up there on Prairie Breeze? Was there much opposition to those projects?
No.
How about with upstream?
Upstream, there has been more. I don't know why. You know, the amount of people that are opposed against it, probably only 4 or 5. But they do make a lot of noise all the time. There's issues like wind noise, and they don't like the sight of them. And why would you let a large developer come in? Mm-hmm. That's one of the biggest issues there. And you know, the local people don't have that kind of money to do that. I don't know where they think this development or this economic development in your county is going to come from. I really don't.
Now, throughout the Prairie Breeze and upstream experiences up in Antelope County, your county had the opportunity to revisit their zoning regs several times. Isn't that right?
Yes, we did.
And you've made some changes.
First, setbacks on our first zoning was 1,000 foot. And then, you know, we had some complaints about that, so the company agreed to go to 2,000. And so the last 2 projects are 2,000, unless you're a supporter of, or have a wind tower on your farm, you can sign off to have it closer. Now that this new zoning regulations that we're in the process of making, why they wanted 2,700 foot, and so we went to 24. And then the clustering, you know, amount of towers that they allow within a certain period of time, they want that to be less. And so we have gone with that too. It does limit some people from getting a tower.
Yeah, the larger the setbacks, the more land you're taking out of play, right?
Yes,
And that means fewer people can participate,
yes,
and it means less tax revenue to the county, right?
yes.
All right, so
No,
it's
well, the amount of towers are, when they first lined the project up, you know, the amount of towers they put in were quite a few more than what they have selected. I mean, that's only the way that project goes, because they know there's some of them probably aren't going to work out.
right. Now, you've got a particularly interesting perspective because you've seen this from both sides, both as a participating landowner, but also as a government official who's trying to balance, you know, between economic development but landowner rights.
That's correct.
So from that perspective, how did you see this process playing out on the 2 projects in your area, Prairie Breeze and Antelope, or upstream?
Well, the amount of tax dollars that Prairie Breeze 1, 2, and 3 have brought into our county is substantial. You know, there's a lot of money goes into our public school system. There's a lot of money goes to the Northeast Community College. Taxes, the school systems all have a budget, the county has a budget, the college has a budget, and they're not gonna go down. So that money has to come from someplace, whether it's from them wind tower people or raise your property taxes or something else.
Until we figure out how to grow it on trees.
Well, I don't think that's gonna happen.
Or you become an ex-football coach from Nebraska. Is that too soon? Too soon for that one? Ouch. Well, Mike, let's talk about construction. What types of things did you experience during construction that landowners might benefit from? I mean, what's it like when they build these things?
Sure. Ours was kind of unique in just the sheer scale of the project at 400 megawatts. It's obviously the biggest one that has been built to date in the state. And so I believe there were about 10,000 truckloads of either road material or product for the project itself that came into our little neighborhood. So organized mass chaos, I guess, for about 16 months during construction. And I was thinking about this on the drive up here yesterday. My house sits in the corner of a section, and I also own the quarter across the road where I sometimes park my equipment. And I had gotten done baling a field and parked the tractor and baler across the road, and it's a short walk across the road to my house. And I stood there for 20 minutes one day waiting for trucks to go by. And here I live, 14 miles out in the country on gravel roads. That was just so strange and bizarre to me. And I mean, it was a laugh. You had to just laugh at it because it was truck after truck after truck. That being said, we were all very impressed at the coordination. We had about 350 workers there during the construction process. But those are broke down into several specialized crews, and the way they interacted with each other, and then during our harvest time, as you all know, gets pretty hectic with grain trucks running up and down the road, especially that third or fourth or fifth week into harvest. Everybody's blurry-eyed and working 16 hours a day, and I was deathly afraid of the danger of not only the construction traffic, but my farmer traffic from all of our farmers in the area. Knock on wood, no incidents whatsoever. Everyone stayed out of each other's way and went remarkably well.
How about your experience, Leroy?
We had several minimum maintenance roads where they put these towers on, and they had to build those roads up to government specs. So there was a lot of new culverts and so forth put in. There was a few new bridges put in by them. But we did have a lot of traffic, on our roads too. And they run water trucks and so forth on those roads to keep the dust down. And I cannot complain about the way they did that. Just like he said, they did her in phases.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the roads and the bridges improvements. Who paid for that?
The wind tower companies.
Okay, that's part of their development costs. That didn't come out of the tax.
No.
The tax end of it.
There was a 7-mile stretch of road that's 3 miles south and going west that was a blacktop road. It was a poor blacktop road when the county had it. Well, that's where they set their yard up, and they were really hard on that road. Of course, they agreed to refix that road. And I'll tell you, that road's just as good as a highway today. Our county could have never afforded to do that on its own. I'll bet you they spent $2-3 million on that stretch of road. Just my guess.
Now, it's not uncommon when you're building a wind farm that you have to move cranes across farmland. Just it's the nature of moving from one location to another. It's kind of unavoidable, and when they do that, it's going to create ruts and damage the farm land. Did you have any experience with that, and did the developer remediate that to your satisfaction?
Yes, they moved the crane across my place. Fortunately enough, we were done picking corn at that time, so after they done moved the crane, they come in with rippers and rip that land all up, fix the fences, probably better in some places than they were in others.
Mike, similar question. Did you have road improvements as part of the Grand Prairie project?
Absolutely. because of the size of the project, I think there were roughly about 100 miles of road that was built up or improved or simply constructed. Some of these were section lines, and they actually built a full-fledged road. And I want to say it was about 1 million ton of aggregate was brought into the county. On average, they probably raised the roads about 14 inches, and then, of course, widened them for their specs, too. So yeah, the county road department is still smiling about that.
Okay, and again, your developer paid for
Oh, absolutely.
for those
Yeah,
improvements.
yeah, absolutely no cost to the county.
Now, Mike, is there anything that you learned through this process? I think you told me a story about you kind of wish you would have known because you had a situation with your cattle that maybe you could have planned for.
Yeah, we thought we were pretty proactive on planning for all scenarios, and I think one thing we maybe dropped the ball a little bit on was planning for reseeding disturbed areas while still using the area to graze, and there are some issues with the initial reseeding not taking, so we'll have to go back in the spring and do that. And in a few extreme cases, we may actually have to fence off some turbine circle areas that are maybe more sensitive ground, a little tougher to get reestablished. And we had addressed that, but just not maybe to the level that we needed to pre-construction.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what it's like to live next to or within a wind farm once it's operational. So, Mike, we'll start with you. How long has Grand Prairie been turning?
We have just finished our first full year of production as of late November.
Okay. Well, just in your own words, describe what your experiences have been over that last year, just living amongst them.
Well, you have to take it with a grain of salt because I've been a supporter for 10 years now, and so maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I love the things. I was pleasantly surprised that the noise level, I was willing to put up with a fair amount of noise just to see it built and see it in production. I have been pleasantly surprised that it's at a much lower level than I maybe feared. One of the things that struck me that I never realized before is how much noise your trees make. We have trees all around our property, shelter belts, really on all sides. And when the wind gets over 13, 14 miles an hour, I've noticed, much to my surprise, that the rustling of the trees all but drowns out the whoosh of the turbine blades. And I would have never guessed that. And so when you go home tonight, I assume many of you are on farms with shelter belts, or the next windy day, just step outside and pay attention to how much noise those trees are making. It's something, you're around it 24/7, so you don't think about it until a project like this comes along and it's very stark reality.
Really? So the trees are louder than the turbines on your property, above about 15 miles an hour?
Yeah, when the wind's below 13, 15 mile an hour, then you can hear the whoosh of the turbines. And then, of course, if it's 40 mile an hour, you can hear occasionally whoosh of the turbines above the tree noise, too. But 90% of the time, we are in that middle ground where at the home location, it really does a great job of disguising the turbine noise.
And that's with 14 turbines within a mile of your place?
Yeah, absolutely, and pick a direction. They're all the way around me.
Leroy, what's your experience been with noise and sound from the turbine?
Well, we have quite a few trees around our place too, and we have 5 turbines that are west and northwest of us, and they got 2, one of my own and another one off to the east of me. And the air is heavy. You can hear the noise of the turbines a little bit more. And one night, we went to bed there, and we could just listen. We could hear that turbine a little bit, but pretty soon the furnace kicked in. We have a natural gas furnace. Heck, that furnace made way more noise than that did. And also, a dishwasher makes a lot more noise than that turbine in your house.
How does it compare to other typical sounds up where you're at? I mean, say blowers, grinders, other farm machinery?
Right now, if you go outside, you can hear way more drying fans running than you ever will turbines. And in the summertime, there's a lot of diesel and gasoline-powered irrigation motors that you can hear, too.
Have you had any issue with shadow flicker?
I have not had issue at all with shadow flicker, the way mine is situated.
Mike, you've noticed a little bit?
Yeah, we have a patio door that faces east off of our kitchen, and for about 2 days in the spring, and I think it's April, and then 2 days in October, the sun is positioned just right that for about I suppose a long hour, maybe a little more than that, in the mornings, we do get a shadow flicker. So that's, 4 days out of the year for a total of about, say, 6 hours a year. When folks hear the word shadow flicker, you immediately think of strobe light, and I'm sure you've all seen the flashing strobes, very rapid. This is like a slow motion version of that. Even on a 30-mile-an-hour day, that there's only 3 blades, and so it takes a while for that to come around. So it's a very slow motion strobe. Still annoying, but it's not, that fast repetitive that I think some people envision when you talk about shadow flicker.
Depending on which window or door the sun is coming into, is it something you can fix by closing the blinds?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it hasn't impacted your life?
No, it's actually, it's such a small occurrence, and it catches me by surprise when those days show up, that it's more of a novelty than anything to us.
Have the turbines or the access roads had any impact on your operations for irrigation, aerial spraying, seed planting, anything along those lines that you've experienced, at least within the first year of operation?
Very minimal. In very rare situations, a field layout may have changed a little bit because of an access road, but it's also beneficial in many cases too, because these are good roads, they've got good aggregate under them, so when our normal driveways that are not built that well, become bogged down with mud or snow or whatever, we now have access on these nice roads. And they also had to do an awful lot of fencing to accommodate these roads. And, when somebody comes into your place and builds new fence for you, who doesn't love that?
Leroy, how has the wind projects in Antelope County, how has that benefited the community? If you could describe that.
Well, the wind tower people have, I can give you an example today. This morning at 9 o'clock, our school there in Elgin has their Veterans Day program. And the wind tower people are buying the meals for all the veterans. That might be a small thing to some people, but some of us it's not.
Is there still opponents to wind? Or is there still dissension in your community, or has that died down?
Not so much in our community. It's Neely where the new projects are going. That's where most of the opposition is. Most of the people around there, have adjusted to it, and it benefits the community, so let's live with it.
And what has Antelope County been able to do with the additional tax resources?
Our taxes, well, counties, they all have a budget, and we can't raise our lids more than what we're allowed to. So it's really just, it's lowered our property taxes.
And so you've used it primarily to lower taxes as opposed to
Yes.
improvements. Mm-hmm. So my question to you, Mike, how has the presence of the wind farm benefited your community?
Oh, the economic impact was amazing. As I mentioned earlier, there were 350 construction workers here for about 16 months, and I think it's estimated that they spent $7 to $8 million in our local economy. Everybody on Main Street was grinning from ear to ear because the stores were full and just business was booming. After construction, there were 25 jobs created for turbine maintenance, and of course the site manager is the 25th guy. Those are all way above county average on pay scale. These kids, there are 2 or 3, maybe 4 by now, kids that were from the local area and had moved away and saw this as an opportunity to come back home and raise their families. And so we are just thrilled with that. And of course, the property tax relief, you cannot understate the value of that. I don't have to tell you folks what a mess property tax is right now in Nebraska. I think this industry, wind industry, has a real chance to be a game changer in the property tax scenario in Nebraska if we can all get on board and get these built where people want them built.
Well, speaking of getting on board, you said earlier that your project was largely supported in your community. You had very little opposition.
Yes.
Now that the project's up and operating, has that changed opinions? Have people turned against it, or have people continued to support it?
Yeah, we see broad continued support. Like I said, there's a small vocal minority that, I'm not sure you could please no matter what you did. And I think that's probably true with any project, any economic project you bring into a community. So I'm not sure that it's exclusive to wind. But yeah, overall, continued support. We are, like I'd mentioned, we're just finished our first year of production. And as you all know, you pay behind on personal property or on property tax, and so the full first half year's revenue will be made soon. And so we have not felt the full impact yet of the property tax relief, but it is on its way.
Is Holt County looking for more wind?
It depends on who you ask, but yeah, definitely. We have some leftover sites that are permitted. As Leroy mentioned, they always permit more than the actual number to allow for, disqualifications for one reason or another. So we have several licensed or permitted sites that we would love to put turbines on. There's a little bit of a lull in the power market at the moment. So, but I anticipate that in the next year to two, those will be enacted.
Leroy, how would you characterize your experience overall now that you've got a couple years living on your project?
Just recently, we just passed, they're going to build another wind farm up towards north of Neely, and that's a 160 megawatt farm. They're just bringing in the blades and the towers now, and they will start construction on that next spring.
Would you do it again if you had the opportunity?
Oh, yes, I'd do it again.
And I mean, even personally, if you had an opportunity to put another turbine somewhere, would you consider it?
Yes.
Anything that if you had to do it all over again, you would do differently based on what you've learned?
No, I don't think so. I think it went rather smoothly.
Okay. Mike, how about you? Anything that you would rather that you would do differently or wish you would known when you started this process a couple of years ago?
Nothing that we would do differently. We had very reputable people that, fortunately, that we worked with throughout the whole process, and so no bad surprises at all. Maybe it would have helped me knowing that it was not going to be a quick process. I mean, it took almost 10 years, and at the onset, I didn't realize that, and so I could have maybe been a little more prepped with patience, but other than that, no regrets.
Okay, so that 10-year process, that included the developer putting the project together and actually getting it permitted and financed?
Yes, and then, our transmission facility is the Western Area Power Line, and they were in the middle of a 2-year environmental impact review, and so that also delayed our project. We had to wait for their environmental study to be completed before we could go to the next phase in ours.
And you mentioned earlier that there were some environmental concerns over some eagles. Do you know if that has caused any pauses or delays in further build-outs up there in Holt?
Well, definitely in that little corner, it's a non-exclusion area because of that. But in the greater county, that's a very minimal impact.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your comments. We'll turn it open now to the floor for anybody in here who has a question and wants to hear it straight from somebody who knows. Yes, sir.
I'm extremely grateful for your being here. Well, I thought I'd ask you kind of a stupid question, which is, what's not to like about these things? I haven't heard anything negative at all so far. Is there anything not to like?
So the question was, he said, with all due respect, it may sound like a stupid question, but what's there not to like? What is a negative about a wind farm? Because all I've heard is positives.
No,
Mike, do you wanna-
that's a great question, and just like everything else, there are positives and negatives. I hope that we didn't paint an unrealistic, rosy scenario. They're very imposing. Our turbines, when the top of the blade is pointing straight up, it's about 440 feet, and there are 200 of these in a 10 by 12 mile area. So a very imposing site. And then at night, 200 flashing FAA red lights that you can see for miles and miles. And so if you don't like the way they look, you would hate the area. I happen to like the way they look, so it doesn't bother me. They are not perfectly quiet. They do make noise. As far as the economic side of it, yeah, I don't think there is a downside.
Leroy, maybe you can address, having sat through some of the county board meetings where there were members of the opposition who testified against one of the projects up in Antelope County. Do you recall what some of their concerns or complaints were?
Mostly noise, unsightly. You know, I think there's another side to that story up there, but, I don't have all the facts, so I don't know that. But what he was talking about just a little bit ago, some of the towers they have out there, people are getting paid not to plant a crop for a certain period, for a certain area around the wind towers. So there are people out there counting to see if there's bird kill and so forth going on that deals. So
when Nebraska first started looking at these, expanding its wind presence, I had an opportunity to meet with some lawyers over in the Iowa side to talk about their experiences. And one of the things that they said is everybody loves them at the beginning, and then there's a period of time where there's some opposition, because when these things are built, they do change the landscape, and they are large, and there is a little bit of a getting used to them, because they are large and they do change the horizon. But then their experience was, then after a period of time, people get used to them, and a lot of the opposition dies down. Are you seeing that at all up in your area, Leroy? Because you've had, Petersburg has been operating now for, going on 6 years, 7 years. Are people starting to get more used to them? Yes,
I think that's true. The amount of opposition, like I said, is just a few, and that's never going to go away. We have issues with the feed yards, and we have issues with the hog units. If it doesn't please you, I don't want it.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
It don't benefit me.
Leroy both. I represent a wind association in western Nebraska. We've been soliciting a developer since 2009. When you guys organized, how did you determine you were going to compensate those who only got a transmission line on their property? And what about those who got nothing? Was there any compensation or any incentive for people who did not get a tower?
How about that, Mike? How did you guys handle it in Holt?
Sure. As far as the transmission line negotiations, those were directly between the affected landowners and the development company. Those of us who did not have transmission lines crossing our property were not involved in that process. So it was a direct negotiation between the two and direct compensation. As far as the way we looked at it with the our project anyways, it was basically let the chips fall where they may. You either qualified for a turbine or you did not, and there was no compensation if you did not.
Senator Har.
Yeah, well, I worked on wind for 8 years in the legislature, and some of my frustrations, one was working with Mike DeGan, but no, that.
And I do apologize for that.
No, that worked out fine, but towards the end, and we finally got the regulation passed when Senator McAllister got involved, and you were part of that. And, but it seems that the anti-people are getting better organized. And could you talk a little, I mean, even in your area, what's happening that people seem to be getting better organized and better financed?
Well, I don't know if they're so much better financed. They're just, they come to all of our board meetings. They're consistent, you know, and any little thing that they can bring up, they will.
How about you, Mike? Because I agree. It seems that they are very consistent, and the message is consistent, and we're seeing it county to county. So there definitely seems to be a much more coordinated effort, including out-state experts that they're bringing in. Are you seeing that in Holt, and do you have any idea what's motivating that?
Yeah, not so much in Holt, but points west, I definitely see the increase. I think part of it is a statement of our times. I think they have perhaps gotten some courage from our current political environment in the nation. In our scenario, the opponents that we have seen, more or less, facts be damned. Let's throw everything on the wall that we can, and maybe something will accidentally stick. Many of their points were things that were, you know, disproven way before I became involved with the wind energy industry, and so that's a little bit frustrating that they're recycling old material. You know, that being said, I think a lot of it is just human nature.
Yeah, we continue to hear the allegation that wind turbines kill people, despite the fact that there's not a single death or injury related to a wind turbine other than somebody who was working on one. But be that as it may, sir.
Well, first, thank you for being here today. Question about birds, raptors, wildlife. Do you see any effects on your land?
You know, I monitor as much as I can because I'm very curious. Science tells us that, yes, somewhere birds are flying into these things. At what rate, you know, I think that's arguable. The statistics I've seen are quite low. In my personal instance, I have yet to find a bird, but it'd be easy to miss one too. That's a pretty big area with, you know, some brush and whatnot growing with predators around. You could easily miss out on catching one.
Now, Mike, on Grand Prairie, do you know if Game and Parks was involved in that siting process and approval process?
Very much so. Them and especially Fish and Wildlife, both very much involved.
And they're involved in the process very early on to ensure that these are not sited in areas that are going to be in high traffic areas that would cause unnecessary harm to wildlife.
Absolutely, yeah. If you're in a migratory path, you just well forget about a wind project. It is not going to happen.
On a regular basis, I'll get a call from a customer being approached by wind developers. We're not in prime wind development territory, but what would be some keys to tell these customers, like, when are you sure that the developer is committing to something and not just fishing for some lease on your land?
Well, I guess what they always told me back in the beginning is you need three things for a successful wind project. You have to have good wind, which a lot of Nebraska does, but some parts of the state does not have especially good wind. You have to have transmission access. That's a deal killer. It's too expensive right now to build those any length to get the power out. And third, you have to have a willing and cooperative landowner group. I think some projects in the state were killed because they did not have the support of the local landowners. how you can tell they're serious is when they start discussing the initial option contract that you may negotiate.
The only thing else I would add is not all developers are created equal. Do your homework. Look for track record. The reputable developers have a well-established track record of actually building projects as opposed to the fly-by-night folks that are out there just, trying to gather information. So what?
Quick question, how far are your homes from the closest tower, how many feet?
My closest one is just shy of a half mile. My county, Holt County, does have a half-mile residence setback, but I signed a waiver to go inside that, and they barely did. If I had to put a tape to it, 2,500 feet.
Leroy?
I would say mine's about 1,500 foot to the west, but I have the trees and so forth on the north and west of the place.
All right, well, thank you all. That concludes our session, and let's give a round of applause for our panel.